Well, good afternoon. As Holly said, we have a marvelous partnership with the Book Festival. They are as easy to work with as anyone else in town, and it really has been a marvelous occasion for all of you to come today. On behalf of the foundation, I want to welcome you, and I want to welcome you in particular to this afternoon's presentation by Salman Rushdie. A little bit about the Welty Foundation first. Our primary mission is to preserve the literary legacy of Eudora Welty. We do that in a multitude of ways, but primarily working hand in glove with the Department of Archives and History to preserve Eudora's home and garden over in Belhaven, and also working with the Archives Department to preserve her collection of manuscripts, correspondence, books, documents, photographs that now total more than 230 cubic feet of materials. It's unbelievable. We also vigorously support educational programs like this one. They are designed, we think, to encourage writers and to encourage maybe readers like you and me of all stripes and ages. Let me explain the genesis of the program today. In 1983, Harvard University invited Eudora Welty to give a series of lectures. The lectures were later collected as essays in a volume entitled One Writer's Beginnings. Published by Harvard University Press, One Writer's Beginnings became a New York Times bestseller for more than a year, and in fact was Harvard University Press's first national bestseller. It details the inescapable bond between Eudora's childhood and her later career as a writer, and describes how her early experiences formed her individual literary voice. Looking for a way to promote Eudora on a national scale, the Welty Foundation, and particularly with the keen advice of our National Advisory Board, struck upon the idea of asking other writers of significance to speak in their own words about their beginnings as a writer and what formed their individual literary voices. Endowed by Martha Dalrymple of Amory and by the Welty family, the Eudora Welty Lecture is now an annual fall event in Washington, D.C. Our inaugural lecturer was this afternoon's speaker, Salman Rushdie. He filled the Washington National Cathedral. It's an incredible sight, 1,275 seats. Last year, our lecturer was Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the Nigerian writer. This fall, on October the 9th, I'm pleased to say that Richard Ford will deliver the Welty Lecture at the Folger Shakespeare Library. The publisher of the New York Review of Books, Mr. Ray Hederman, will introduce Richard. As a footnote, some of you may know this, they were classmates at Murrah High School years ago. Tickets are now on sale at the Folger box office online. I hope you'll make plans to come to D.C. and hear Richard. And now to the pleasant task at hand, that of introducing Mr. Rushdie. In 1981, with publication of his second novel, Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie burst upon the international literary scene like one of those giant chrysanthemum fireworks on the 4th of July. Midnight's Children was awarded the Booker Prize for a novel written in English by a citizen of the United Kingdom. On the 25th anniversary of the Booker Prize, Midnight's Children was chosen the Booker of Bookers. And on the 40th anniversary of the prize, by public vote, it was selected as the best of all the Booker Prize winners. He has published 13 novels, a book of stories, and 4 works of nonfiction. His works have been translated into more than 40 languages. In 1989, many of you will recall, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, a religious decision, calling for the assassination of Mr. Rushdie because of his novel, The Satanic Verses. Rushdie went underground for several years, and during that time, his British protectors asked him if he could come up with a code name that they could use to call him during his hiding. And despite the dire circumstances, he managed to keep some sense of humor. He selected Joseph Anton, a combination of the first names of two writers whom he loved, Joseph Conrad and Anton Chekhov. In his memoir of the same title, Joseph Anton, he describes his personal, and I would say heroic, stand he dared to take opposing any curtailment of a writer's freedom. A fellow of the British Royal Society of Literature, he has won not just a stream, but a river of prizes from Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria, the United States, from cities around the world and from universities and libraries around the globe. He holds honorary doctorates from European and American universities. In the United States, he has served as honorary professor in the humanities at MIT, distinguished professor at Emory University, and currently he is distinguished writer in residence at New York University. In 2008, he became a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and received one of my favorite awards. We should all get one like this, a library lion of the New York Public Library. That same year, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth. He has now become a citizen of the United States, so we can claim him as an American writer. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Salman Rushdie.
Thank you. See, I have to change my glasses, which means now I can't see you. But I presume like somebody came, right? I mean, the room, there are people in the room. Yes, that's good. Thank you, Holmes, for that wonderful introduction. And just to say, I'm very happy to be here in Jackson at last. And I'm going to say just a couple of words about the fact that I did once have the good fortune to have lunch with Eudora Welty. And at the very end of the lunch, she very sweetly said to me, would I please come and visit her in Jackson? So here I am, Eudora, etc. I'm just a little bit late. I'm sorry, but anyway, it's been great. I was able to see her home and check out her books, and the books she owned rather than the ones that she wrote. And I thought I'd just begin by talking about that lunch. It was a long time ago. It was in London in the early 80s, and her novel Losing Battles had just been published in the UK a long time after it was published in America. About 12 years after it came out here, it was published in England by the feminist publishing house Virago. And I had been asked by a newspaper to review it, which I did, and I found it incredibly funny. I don't often laugh out loud reading books, but I did laugh out loud a lot reading Losing Battles, and so I wrote this nice review of it. And so Eudora showed up in London for a few days for the book publication, and the publishers asked me to a small lunch for her at a restaurant in Covent Garden. I really had very little idea of who I was going to meet, because other than her books, I didn't know much about her at the time. And I kind of thought she might be a kind of little old provincial lady, kind of a little bit lost in the big city. And she was, of course, absolutely nothing of the sort. She was, first of all, surprisingly tall and immensely sophisticated and anecdotal, and kind of regaled us for a couple of hours with stories of both. I remember a lot of stories about Paris and a lot of stories about photography, both of which she loved. And as the lunch drew to a close, we were having coffee, and I realized that I had been so kind of swept away by her storytelling that I hadn't asked her anything about writing in general or her writing in particular. And she was then what seemed impossibly old to me. In other words, she was the age then that I am now. and I was, I don't know, 33 or something. And I thought, I had better talk to her a little bit about her writing, because she's so incredibly old that I might never see her again. and I mean, as it happens, I sadly did never see her again. But so I thought, I better think of something to say. And I couldn't really think of a proper question. And so in a kind of blurt, I said, William Faulkner. And she looked at me kind of kindly. Said, yes, dear, she said, what about him? And I thought, yeah, exactly, what about him? Now what? And so I said, on the whole, I said, would you say that he had been a help or a hindrance to you? And well, she said, well, dear, neither one. She said, it's kind of like having a big mountain in the neighborhood. It's very nice to know it's there, but it doesn't help you do your work. So this was a very fine reply, but I sort of screwed up my courage and asked a follow-up question. I said, so do you not think of Faulkner as one of the writers who are closest to you? Oh, no, dear, she said, affecting shock. I'm from Jackson, he's from Oxford, it's miles away. So that was my lunch with Eudora. Anyway, it was kind of left a very strong impression. I was here earlier today. I was listening to Jesmyn Ward talking about her writing and talking about her very deep roots, in Mississippi, and it reminded me that I always kind of envied writers like that, like Eudora, like William Faulkner, like Jesmyn Ward, because of the depth of those roots, with their, in the case of Faulkner's ability to take this tiny patch of the earth and make a lifetime of masterpieces out of it. I mean, my life hasn't been like that. My life has been more wandering. And perhaps as a result of this, my literary beginnings, since I'm going to try and follow Eudora by talking about my own literary beginnings, my beginnings were slow and filled with error. It took me quite a long time to find my way as a writer. And I was born and I grew up in what was then called Bombay, in India, and what some of us still call Bombay. And my parents didn't read many novels. My father knew a good deal of in particular, Urdu language poetry. Urdu was my mother tongue. And when amongst friends in the evening he would recite, they would all take turns reciting the verses of various of these great Urdu poets. I wasn't that interested in Urdu poetry at the time. I became more interested subsequently. But both my parents, actually, as it happened, were excellent storytellers. I'm just going to read you a small passage that I wrote about them in the memoir that Holmes mentioned, Joseph Anton. And I should explain to you about this memoir that the memoir is written in the third person for reasons too complicated to explain right now. But so when it says he, that's me. Right? So when he was a small boy, his father at bedtime told him the great wonder tales of the East, told and retold them and remade them and reinvented them in his own way. The stories of Scheherazade from the 1001 Nights, stories told against death to prove the ability of stories to civilize and overcome even the most murderous of tyrants. And the animal fables of the Panchatantra and the marvels that poured like a waterfall from the so-called ocean of the streams of story, the immense story collection created in Kashmir where his ancestors had been born. And the tales of mighty heroes collected in the Hamzanama and the adventures of Hatim Tai. To grow up steeped in these tellings was to learn two unforgettable lessons. First, that stories were not true. There were no real genies in bottles, or flying carpets, or wonderful lamps. But by being untrue, they could make you feel and know truths that the truth could not tell you. And second, that they all belonged to him, just as they belonged to his father and to everyone else. They were all his, as they were his father's, bright stories and dark stories, sacred stories and profane. His to alter and renew and discard and pick up again, as and when he pleased, to laugh at and rejoice in and live in and with and by, and to give the stories life by loving them and be given life by them in return. Man is the storytelling animal, the only creature on earth that tells itself stories to understand what kind of creature it is. The story is our birthright, and nobody can take it away. His mother, Nagin, had stories for him too. Nagin Rushdie had been born Zora Butt. When she married her husband, she changed not just her surname, but her given name as well, reinventing herself for him, leaving behind the Zora he didn't want to think about, who had once been deeply in love with another man. Whether she was Zora or Nagin in her heart of hearts, her son never knew, because she never talked to him about the man she left behind, choosing instead to spill everyone else's secrets except her own. She was a gossip of world class. And sitting on her bed, pressing her feet the way she liked him to, he, her eldest child and only son, drank in these delicious and sometimes salacious local news stories she carried in her head. The gigantic, branching, interwoven forests of whispering family trees she bore within her, hung with the juicy, forbidden fruit of scandal. And these secrets, he came to feel, also belonged to him, for once a secret had been told, it no longer belonged to her who told it, but to him who received it. If you did not want a secret to get out, there was only one rule: tell it to nobody. This rule, too, would be useful to him in later life. In that later life, when he became a writer, his mother said to him, "I'm going to stop telling you these things because you put them in your books and then I get into trouble." Which was true, and perhaps she would have been well advised to stop. But gossip was her addiction, and she could not. Luckily for me. Well, that was one kind of beginning, a boy at his parents' feet, listening and learning. Both my parents told me that when their friends asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would say that I wanted to be a writer. I have no memory of this myself, but my parents told me I said it, and so it must be true. I wondered what my 6 or 7-year-old self, my 9 or 10-year-old self might have meant by this remark, and have concluded that what I was really saying was that I loved being a reader and dreamed about becoming a part of the world I loved, the world of books. But wanting to be a writer and being a writer are not the same thing. And in my case, the journey from wanting to being was not an easy one. There are writers who, like the goddess Athena, spring fully formed from the head of Zeus and rocket into the literary sky. Zadie Smith and Ian McEwan are examples of this impressive precocity. My way was slower and the road was full of potholes, not unlike. I was going to say New York, but I did read a lot as a child, and not always wisely, smuggling comic books into my bedroom and believing that my parents didn't know. So Superman and Batman, Wonder Woman and Aquaman entered my life at an early age, and to this day, I can tell a Joker from a Riddler, and I know the difference between green and red kryptonite. Also, from the wonderful paperback lending library, at the wonderfully named Scandal Point, which was just down the road from our house, I was able to borrow for pocket money many alliteratively titled volumes by Earl Stanley Gardner: The Case of the Mandarin Murder, The Case of the Lucky Legs, which detailed the exploits of the great defense lawyer Perry Mason, and the many defeats of his pathetic adversary, the prosecutor Hamilton Burger, named after fast food, but slow of mind and phrase. One of the enduring mysteries of these murder mysteries was exactly how, after so many defeats, Ham Burger managed to keep his job. Somebody told me, I have no idea if it was true, that Earl Stanley Gardner had 3 Airstream trailers on his lawn, with a secretary in each one, and spent his days dictating 3 separate Perry Mason mysteries to the 3 assistants, and had a fertile enough imagination to keep all 3 ladies fully employed. That, I thought, was a literary goal worth aspiring to. Never made it. At the foot of the little hill in the Breach Candy district of Bombay where I grew up, there was a magical bookstore called Reader's Paradise, in which I spent many of the happiest hours of my childhood. The English children's books I found there, the ones that made it all the way to India, included Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which made a deep impression on me, that so deep that to this day I am able to recite from memory the whole of Jabberwocky and The Walrus and the Carpenter. Don't tempt me. Strangely, they did not include Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh never made it to India, which was a loss. I found out about him too late, when I was sort of too old for the bear of little brain. There was a series of books, English children's books, collectively known as Swallows and Amazons, which were about 2 families of children having adventures in small sailboats on an unnamed lake in the Lake District of Britain. These books fascinated me because of the incredible degree of personal freedom enjoyed by the children, who seemed free to wander the region with only the faintest of adult supervision. To that young boy in Bombay, with such wild liberty, seemed more fantastic than anything Alice found down the rabbit hole, and England came to seem like an alluring place. My mother's parents, my maternal grandparents, lived in the university town of Aligarh, south of Delhi. My grandfather, Dr. Butt, was a familiar figure, bicycling through the streets of the town as he went about his rounds. He was also connected to the university, and so I would often sit on the back of his bike, and he would take his bookish grandson to the university library to choose whatever books I pleased. In those days, the 2 most popular English language authors in India were Agatha Christie and P.G. Wodehouse. And I would clamber around the gloomy book stacks and bring down piles of Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple mysteries, and tales of Bertie Wooster and Jeeves, and the Earl of Emsworth and his beloved pig, the Empress of Blandings. These 2 were amongst my earliest and most formative literary influences. I must have been about 10 years old when I first saw the film of The Wizard of Oz. And it made such a deep impression on me that I went home and wrote a story, my first fiction, I think, called unoriginally Over the Rainbow. But it wasn't about Oz. It was about a boy like myself in a city like Bombay who finds one day, as he's walking along the sidewalk, not the end of the rainbow, but the beginning of the rainbow, broad, high rainbow arcing up into the sky, away from him, usefully with steps cut into it. So he climbs up and over, he goes over the rainbow, and he has adventures which, mercifully, I don't remember. I remember that he meets various fantastic creatures that I don't recall. I do recall there was a talking pianola. Anyway, when my father read the story, he took it away and he got his secretary to type it up, and then he said, if I give this to you, you're going to lose it. So I'm going to look after it. So he said he'd look after it so it didn't get lost, because children, of course, were not to be trusted. And then he lost it, which proves that actually one of the messages of The Wizard of Oz is that grown-ups are the ones you can't trust. You know, Aunt Em and Uncle Henry can't protect Toto from Miss Gulch. And even the wizard, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, is a fraud. So my father joins that group. When he passed away, we searched all his papers and files trying to find it, and it wasn't there, so I have no idea what happened to it. Anyway. One other literary memory from childhood still annoys me, even more than my father's misplacement of my first work of fiction. This has to do with limericks. I used to love limericks. This is perhaps a result of reading Edward Lear, and certainly because of reading the extraordinary limericks in Lewis Carroll's otherwise unexceptional books about Sylvie and Bruno. They're two books that are really, really bad, but they have these wonderful limericks. But they're not exactly limericks, but they're crazy rhymes. I thought I saw a banker's clerk descending from a bus. I looked again and saw it was a hippopotamus. If this should come to dine, I said, there won't be much for us. There's another one like that. I thought I saw a rattlesnake that questioned me in Greek. I looked again and saw it was the middle of next week. The one thing I regret, I said, is that it cannot speak. So I became interested in kind of nonsense verse. And actually, my favorite limerick was what one might call a meta-limerick. It's a limerick about the old man of Japan. You know about the old man of Japan? There was an old man of Japan who could never get limericks to scan. When they asked him why, he replied with a sigh, well, you see, it's because I always try and put as many words into the last line as I possibly can. Anyway, so there was a day when I was at school, and in English class, we were asked to write a limerick. And everybody else was kind of struggling, and because I had this history of being fond of nonsense verse, I wrote kind of 15. And then the teacher accused me of plagiarism. The teacher accused me of cheating. And I felt this incredible sense of injustice. I thought, how could I have cheated? You know, I didn't know that the test was going to be set, you know, and I felt this. I mean, here I am, I'm 71 years old, I'm still telling you the story. And, you know, it still pisses me off. From these various small acorns, you know, the tree would eventually grow. It began with an uprooting. In January of 1961, I left Bombay, and I went to boarding school in England, at Rugby School. And I should emphasize that this was my choice. It wasn't forced on me. My mother didn't want me to go, and my father left the final decision to me. I've asked myself many times since, what made that 13-year-old boy leave home? I was very happy in Bombay and at my school. I had lots of friends. Yet something drove me across the world. I asked myself, was it something to do with, did I have some hitherto unsuspected spirit of adventure? Nobody had ever thought of me as an adventurous kid. But then I did this thing. I was a notoriously good and quiet child. I mean, as disgusting as that sounds. Unlike my much naughtier and therefore more enjoyable sisters. I wondered whether it was caused by these children's books I'd been reading, these unsupervised swallows and Amazons. I had also read boarding school stories about English boarding schools. So this is before J.K. Rowling reinvented the English boarding school story by adding magic, you know. These were boarding school stories without magic. I mean, there was a dreadful series about a fat boy called Billy Bunter, who was at a school called Greyfriars, didn't exist. And there was actually an Indian boy at Greyfriars who was an aristocratic Indian called Hari Jamset Ram Singh, who spoke very strangely. Instead of saying, for example, that he was thirsty, he would say, the thirstfulness is terrific. If he was angry, the wrathfulness was terrific, and so on. But he was a popular boy, and I thought maybe I would be popular too. Anyway, so I go to England, and whether it's, you know, the Swallows and Amazons' fault or Billy Bunter's fault, I'm not sure, but there I was, and when I got there, I discovered that it wasn't anything like those books. And instead, I encountered racial prejudice for the first time, and learned for the first time what it was to be somebody else's other, judged not by my character, but by my ethnicity. It was a sort of radical awakening. The almost 18-year-old who left rugby school was still fairly conservative, in that sense, an unremarkable product of a British boarding school education. But about racism, he already knew everything. So much so that even though I already had won a place at Cambridge University, I asked my parents to allow me to refuse it and go to college nearer home. My father persuaded me to go, and I'm glad he did, because my Cambridge experience was the opposite of those rugby years, a time that healed the wounds of school and showed me in England that I might be able to live in. And this was a time at which I woke up into something like my adult self. But in the 4 months or so that intervened between school and college, I wrote a long text called Terminal Report, a thinly fictionalized account of my final months at rugby school, in which my experience of racial prejudice featured strongly. This text, too, has been lost, this time by me, which proves that children can be as careless as their parents. But I know from what little of it I remember that it was pretty awful stuff. But it was a document of a moment, and I'm sorry that I don't have it anymore. At Cambridge, this is Cambridge. Remember, I was at Cambridge from 1965 to 1968. This is like the historical epicenter of the 60s and the age of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So not a bad time to go to college if you're going to go to college. Bill Clinton was at Oxford, but I inhaled. At Cambridge, I discovered a tolerant Britain that erased my memories of this other earlier one. I also discovered internationalism and Vietnam protests and feminism and civil rights and flower power and girls. I discovered the writing of Jorge Luis Borges and James Joyce, both of whom blew open little windows in my head. And from the study of history, I did a degree in history. I learned that the past is contested territory and reality is not a given, but a thing we make. I had this brilliant history professor called Arthur Hibbert, who told me something I never forgot, which is he said, you should never write history until you can hear the people speak, because if you can't hear them speak, you don't know them well enough and you can't tell their story. And I thought, actually, very good advice for the writing of fiction. If you can't hear people speak, you don't know who they are. And I've since then, one of the ways I begin to think about character is I ask myself how the person would speak, how big is their vocabulary? Do they use bad language? Are they talkative or not talkative? Are they polite or impolite? When you answer a lot of questions about the way people talk, you end up already knowing them before you know anything else about them. When I was at university, I didn't spend that much of my time for example, in student journalism. I spent most of it in student theater as an actor, not a writer. And I took part in plays by Brecht and Ben Jonson and Ionesco and all sorts of things. I did do some writing for the student newspaper, Varsity, not very successfully. My last assignment was to write a piece about that. It was a period when there was a whole spate of thefts from undergraduate rooms and across the university, and I was asked to cover the story. And so in kind of classic new journalism style, I thought the way to cover the story is to be the thief, to go around the different colleges and go up in various staircases and push open people's doors and see what I could steal. If the rooms, I'd make lists of them, right? So I did this. I didn't actually steal anything, but I made lists of everything I could have stolen. Unfortunately, there's one room I entered which contained a very large amount of expensive audio equipment and a fridge containing a lot of expensive alcohol. So I wrote all this down, and it turned out to be the room of the editor of the student newspaper. And I mean, to his credit, he did not censor the piece and ran it. However, I was never asked to write for the paper again. By the time I left Cambridge, I knew that little boy who said he wanted to be a writer had been right, that I did want to be a writer. But I also wanted to be an actor. And after a few efforts after I left university, I was in London, and at that time in London, there was a very, very active fringe theatre going on outside the West End. And I was in a few of those plays, and including one mercifully unrecorded performance as an agony aunt, a kind of Miss Lonely Hearts figure, in a long black dress with a long blonde wig and a black Zapata moustache. I thought I would probably not go any further down that path, and I decided to try and write. My father didn't like the idea about my being a writer. Writing wasn't a job. Writing was a hobby. And working with him in his textile factory, that would be a job. But I said I wanted to be a writer, and he said, what, after all that money spent on my fancy foreign education, and after my mother had to put up with my absence for much of the previous 8 years, and I said I wanted to go back to England and write. And this piteous cry burst out of my father. It was completely involuntary, expressing what he most profoundly thought. He said, "What will I tell my friends?" I mean, to be fair to him, once he understood that I was serious, he supported my decision. He bought me a plane ticket back to London, put some money in my pocket to get me started. Now that I'm a parent too, I know how hard this must have been for him and my mother. I never lived at home again and saw them only intermittently when I crossed the world, or they did. And I was their eldest child and their only son. But through all those long years of difficulty that followed, they never once said, "Give it up and come home." It was what I wanted, and so they loved me enough to want it too. I'm glad they lived long enough to see that it wasn't a completely stupid idea. Why come back to London, we say? Well, in part it's because in those days, in South Asia, it was very hard to lead a literary life. You either had to be personally wealthy, or be willing to be extremely broke and live with your parents, or you had to get a full-time job doing something else and write at the weekends. And the absence in those days of a literary milieu felt important because it meant there was no informed opinion to test your early work against, to improve and to harden it by subjecting it to good criticism. None of this is true anymore, by the way. These days, that literary world does exist, and many young writers now don't feel the need to leave India in order to develop themselves as writers. They stay home. But it was true then. And there's one more thing. In 1968, when I graduated, my parents moved from my beloved hometown of Bombay to Karachi in Pakistan, which I really disliked. If Bombay was no longer available to me, and if the choice was between London and Karachi, which it was, I chose London. So now I'm 21 years old in London, and I'm sharing a house with 4 college friends in the west of the city, near the New King's Road, which I should say is the utterly ungroovy extension of the really groovy King's Road. So I was completely at the non-trendy end. And I had a room in the attic, and to get into it, I had to climb up a wooden ladder, go through a hatch, and I could pull the ladder up after me and close the hatch, and then I was in this private kind of triangular universe. And sort of like there's this wooden pyramid, and it felt like a perfect literary garret, exactly where you should start as a writer. But I soon discovered that I really had no idea how or what to actually write. I sat for long hours in this wooden pyramid, unproductive and entombed, like a mummy without a sarcophagus. And I had to come out for several days a week to earn money, and so I worked as an advertising copywriter. And I found that, slightly shamefully, that I was able, with a degree of competence, to do that. So I ended up writing about dog food, potato chips, cigarettes, and perfume. My own work remained obstinately absent. But cat food commercials, that was no problem. To become a writer, one must first understand oneself. And it's harder to reach that understanding when yourself is spread out between 3 countries. And I think it took me a long time to answer those questions. I had 4 unpublished texts that I wrote in those years. Unpublished novels, I mean, some longer, some shorter fictional texts. And I have to say, I'm now immensely grateful that those texts did not get published, because they really were awful. And I did, as a kind of act of considerable courage, when Emory University in Atlanta bought my archive, I let them have the manuscripts of those texts. So if you're really feeling masochistic, you could go to Atlanta and read them, and then you'll think much less of me. And I had one published novel, a fantasy novel called Grimus, and that novel, nowadays I look at it and it reveals to me that the author has really not fully worked himself out, hasn't fully understood what are his books to write rather than other people's books to copy. And I look at it and it seems somehow fitful. There'll be a paragraph here and there that I think, oh, well, that's all right, that's not so bad. And then there'll be a few pages which make me want to hide behind the furniture, particularly the pages about sex. There are a few people who still like this book, I have to say, but in general, it had a pretty bumpy ride on publication. And in retrospect, I think I have to feel almost grateful for that, because it forced me to look at my writing very self-critically and unsparingly and work out what, in my opinion, not that of critics, what, in my opinion, I was doing wrong. And it was during this period of savage introspection that my life as a writer really began. I used the small advance. I mean, £700 doesn't sound like a lot, but this was 1975, so that's probably more like $10,000 or $12,000 now. But anyway, I took that money and I just decided to go to India and to travel around it as long as I could, as cheaply as I could, make the money last as long as possible. And on that journey, I was there for about 4.5, almost 5 months. On that journey of like 15-hour bus rides and humble hostelries, my novel Midnight's Children was born. Just to put this in context, this was the year that India became a nuclear power, and Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party in England, when the Baader-Meinhof gang was on trial in Stuttgart, and Bill Clinton married Hillary Rodham, and the last Americans were evacuated from Saigon, and Generalissimo Franco died. In Cambodia, it was the Khmer Rouge's bloody year zero. In literature, E.L. Doctorow published Ragtime that year, and Eugenio Montale won the Nobel Prize. And just after my return from India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was convicted, who was then the Prime Minister, was convicted of election fraud. And 1 week after my 28th birthday, she declared a state of emergency and assumed tyrannical powers. It was the beginning of a long, dark period in Indian history which would not end until 1977. I understood almost at once that Mrs. Gandhi had somehow become central to my still tentative, unworked out literary plan. At first, however, I decided simply to write a novel about childhood, arising from my memories of my own childhood in Bombay. I spent long hours and days digging out childhood memories from the attics in my mind where they lay gathering dust. I remembered an old clock tower around which we played, and some of the old stores, as well as the bookstore Reader's Paradise. There was the candy store called Bombelli's, and its fabled 3-foot box labeled 1 yard of chocolates. I walked past this window I don't know how many times, seeing this 1 yard of chocolates there. My parents never bought me one. I remembered across the street there was this famous swimming pool called the Breach Candy Swimming Pool, which extraordinarily still had a whites-only policy left over from the empire. And I remembered how angry I was about that. I remembered an English schoolboy friend of mine saying, would I go? There was a point where English members could bring, brown people as their guests. And I was asked if I wanted to go as guest, and I said, no, thank you, I'm not coming. And it was, in a way, sort of my first political decision. I remembered school bullies. I remembered the day the taxi driver's son died during class. I remembered my sister, who was a year younger than me, was kind of tomboyish, and she once beat up a boy who had been teasing me. And his father came over to complain to my father and stood at the door and said, "Your daughter just beat up my son." And my father was very amused and said, "I wouldn't say that too loudly if I was you." I remembered there was this footbridge near the Chowpatty beach, which had on one side the advertising slogan which said, "Esso puts a tiger in your tank." And if you went around the other side, there was a public service warning which said, "Drive like hell and you will get there." I remembered songs and the movies containing the songs, and this whole world came flooding back, and I knew that it was the birth of a book. Traveling to India, both to old haunts and to new places I thought I might want to write about, it felt like a second healing, as important as Cambridge's healing of the wounds inflicted at boarding school. This second healing was the healing of the rift within myself that had begun to separate me from my past. I would write my book, I told myself, to reclaim that past from myself, for myself. Bombay is a city that stands in large part upon land reclaimed from the sea. My book would stand on literary land rescued from the tide of forgetting. I am this world, the book would say, and this world is me. And now, having drunk deeply from India by traveling around it, my plan got more ambitious. Not just this novel about childhood. I thought I would write the most challenging book I could dream of writing, Hollywood or bust. If I was going to fail as a writer, I would prefer to go down in flames rather than as the author of a timid little failure. The question of high ambition is complex, raising as it does issues of ego and other unartistic factors. But what I meant was that I wanted to take the greatest artistic risk I could imagine. I had very little thought of money. In fact, I doubted I'd ever make any. And fame, such a big subject nowadays, literally did not cross my mind. I simply wanted to set the literary bar as high as I possibly could. The last line of one writer's beginnings says, "All serious daring starts from within." And that spirit of serious daring was what, after these long years of confusion, I finally found the courage to embrace. At this point, I remembered a minor character called Salim Sinai, born at the midnight moment of Indian independence, who lay unborn in the abandoned draft of one of these 4 unpublished manuscripts that I'd written. I thought that he might still be useful. And I now put Salim at the center of this new scheme. I understood that his time of birth would oblige me to immensely increase the size of my canvas. If he and India were to be paired, I would need to tell the story of both twins. It was no longer a simple novel of childhood history rushed in. And then Salim, ever a striver for meaning, brought the two strands together, suggesting to me that the whole of modern history happened as it did because of him. That history, the life of his nation twin, was somehow all his fault. With that immodest proposal, the novel's tone of voice, comically assertive, unrelentingly talkative, and with, I hope, a growing pathos in the narrator's increasingly tragic overclaiming, came into being. I even made the boy and the country identical twins. Somebody asked me last night why I gave Salim such a big nose. And the truthful answer is that once I looked at the map of India, and it looked like a very big nose hanging down into the sea, with Sri Lanka hanging off the bottom like a drip. And so I thought, well, I could use that. And so unfortunately, that's why he was cursed with this big nose. Everybody thought that he was me, saying last night, I went to India after the book came out to do a book tour, and I remember walking out on this theater in Delhi and a voice from the audience said, "But he's got a completely ordinary nose." I was very insulted. I thought, it's not completely ordinary, you know. It has some kind of interesting aspects. Never mind. For a while, however, when I started writing this book, I didn't understand it. I certainly didn't understand that Salim needed to be the person telling the story. He wanted to tell it himself. I began to write the book in the third person, and to my frustration, it felt somehow inert. I was pretty sure that there were a bunch of good stories waiting to be told, but the writing was falling short of what the stories needed. And then one day, just as an experiment, I thought, let me see what happens if I let Salim narrate the novel to make the record in his own way, as Saul Bellows' Augie Marsh so enthusiastically sets out to do. I've always thought of that day as the day I became a writer, because what came out of me somehow was what I at once recognized as the best page I'd ever written, in a voice that was not my own, and yet gave me voice. As Salim Sinai poured out of me onto the page, I understood that he was my salvation, and that the best and only thing I could do was to let him rip, to let that omnivorous spirit loose onto the page, and to hang on to his coattails as he ran. I was broke, of course, and the novel took a very long time to write, almost 5 years. So I was forced back into the world of advertising on a part-time basis to pay the rent. So I worked 2 or 3 days a week on the cat food ads and so on. Cigarette ads, awful. And I would come back, I made sure that I worked the second half of the week. So I'd come back on Friday night, staying in this small place in North London, and which was then a pretty down-at-heel neighborhood, and now, of course, it costs $1 zillion like everything else. It's kind of like a British Williamsburg. And I would like ritually take, on Friday night, I would take this very long hot bath to wash away the week's commercial sins. And I would emerge from the bath, so I told myself, as a novelist, pure. And the folks at the agency didn't understand why I wouldn't accept a full-time job, and dangled substantial sums of money under my nose, which I refused. As I look back, I feel a touch of pride at that younger self's dedication to literature, which gave him the strength of mind to resist the blandishment of the enemies of promise. The sirens of the advertising world sang seductively, but I thought of Odysseus lashing himself to the mast of his ship and somehow stayed on course. I say it took me just about 5 years to write this book because I was teaching myself how to write as I wrote it. Would-be writers are everywhere told these days, write what you know. But to this, I would like to add the following footnote. Yes, but only if what you know is interesting. Now, it so happens that I grew up in a very interesting time. I was a member of the first generation of free Indian children to be born for over 200 years after the end of the British Empire. Infused with the new spirit of liberty, but carrying with us also the knowledge of blood, of the great massacres of Muslims by Hindus and Hindus by Muslims that attended the moment of freedom. A transitional generation is exceptional. It is neither of the past nor wholly of the future. And it was my gift as a writer to have that unique moment as my birthright. So yes, I had to learn to write about that. I had to learn how to allow public events and private lives to flow in and around one another, how to avoid being merely topical, but to demonstrate at the same time how history shapes us all, and to ask some of the great questions of literature. Are we masters or victims of our times? Do we make history, or does it unmake us? And can we, by our own choices and actions, shape and change our world? Parenthetically, I was enough of a child of the 60s to answer that last question in the affirmative. The 60s were foolish in many ways, but to be young then was to be convinced that yes, the world needed changing, and yes, we could do it. I have carried that spirit of possibility long enough to see it reborn in the yes, we can spirit that brought Barack Obama to the White House, and my goodness, what an antiquated sentence that sounds like. And in the more recent, the new young activism that is determined to shape the future and believes it has the power to do so. Not only were the times interesting, my family was interesting. I had an uncle who wrote for the movies and was married to a glamorous wife, one of two actor sisters who were my most enjoyably racy relatives. I had another uncle who was a military man who started off as aide-de-camp to Field Marshal Auchinleck, the last commander of the British Army in India, and ended up as a general in the Pakistan Army. I'm sorry to say, close friend of the military dictator Ayub Khan, and to my considerable embarrassment, the founder and first head of the notorious Pakistani Secret Service, the ISI, or Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the same ISI which much later would supervise the safe haven in Pakistan occupied by Osama bin Laden. This was long after my uncle died, of course, but he was the creator of the system that made such things possible. This is the family shame. So on. Anyway, interesting relatives. I was also learning something important as I wrote, in spite of the relatives being interesting. Fiction is not autobiography. The family in the novel has quite a lot in common with my actual family. Salim's grandfather is a doctor, so was mine. He too has an uncle in the movies and another uncle who is a general. His sister is a tomboy, just as mine was. I had a Christian ayah nanny from South India, and so does Salim, and so on. But as I began to create those characters on the page, I found it difficult to bring them to life when they were like the real people. As long as they were just imitations of life, they had no palpable fictional life. And then I began to push the characters away from the real people, to make them unlike their models, and at once they stirred and stood up and lived. So the Christian ayah, working for a time as a nurse, commits the crime from which the story of the novel is born, whereas my actual ayah was law-abiding. And the sister in the novel becomes a wonderful singer, whereas, as anybody who knows my family will tell you, until the arrival of my niece, who is a concert pianist, not a single one of us had any musical gift at all. And you certainly did not ever want to hear any of us sing. And the movie world's uncle, his story darkens towards a tragedy, and his fate is completely unlike my actual uncle's, etc., etc. By the time the book was done, the characters had left their models behind and had become simply themselves. I once read that when Gabriel Garcia Marquez finished working on his masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude, his wife, Mercedes, had to carry the manuscript to the post office. Well, this is the day when there's only one copy. And so she has the job of mailing it to the literary agent. And all the way that she's taking the book to the post office, she's thinking, suppose it's no good. Because then they would have been screwed. And it was good. It was 100 Years of Solitude. So, when I finished Midnight's Children, I remember thinking, as far as I can tell, this is kind of a good book. But after these long, long years of unsuccess, I was utterly lacking in confidence in my own judgment. And I genuinely had no idea if anyone in the world would agree with me. And if nobody agrees with me, I told myself, then maybe I don't know what a good book is and I should stop trying to write one. So there was a lot riding on that book's reception. I mean, Hollywood or bust indeed. Fortunately, it wasn't bust. And I finally had an answer to my father's question, what will I tell my friends? What I remember is the other sort of moment of finishing my beginning, of kind of becoming the person that I wanted to be, was that after the book came out, Midnight's Children, and began to do very well, I was able to quit the advertising agency. So I went in to see the boss, the person that I always thought curiously oxymoronic name, the creative director. And I said to him, you know, I wrote this book, it came out, seems to be doing very well, so I'm going to go off and be a full-time writer, and I quit. And he said, oh, you want a raise? And I said, no, really, I'm just saying that this is what I've always wanted to do, and now it seems that I might be able to do it, and so I quit. And he said, oh, you want a big raise? And I said, no, really, I promise you, I'm not negotiating. I'm supposed to give you 1 month's notice, so this is 1 month's notice, and 31 days from now, I am not going to be coming in the office. And he said, oh, I don't think we can give you as much as that. And literally, until the day I left, he thought I was playing some strange game of chicken. But very sweetly, when the book ended up doing extremely well, when it won the Booker and so on, we used to have these things called telegrams. So I got, yes, for the younger people in the room, I got this telegram from him, which very sweetly it said, "Congratulations, one of us made it." And one of the things, of course, if you've ever worked in the creative department of an ad agency, is everybody is plotting their exit. You know, everybody has like a pilot script for a sitcom, you know, or the manuscript of a novel, or a screenplay, or everybody's got something in the bottom drawer, you know, and that is their dream of their future, you know. And so, congratulations, he said, one of us made it. It was very nice of him. You know, when I was a child, and I used to have this, I had this recurring flying dream. I would dream that I was in my own bed, in my own room, in my own house, and when I opened my eyes in the dream, I was in my own bedroom, and I could simply float upwards, shedding the covering bed sheets, and fly around the bedroom without any trouble at all. And so after a while, I would acquire the courage to fly towards the open window and fly out through the window into the world. And at once, I would begin very, very slowly to lose height. Not frighteningly, not falling, but noticeably. And you know, our house in Bombay was on the top of this little hill, and it became clear to me that there would be a moment at which I would have sunk too low, I wouldn't be able to get back into the bedroom window. And then I'd be down on the street, and that would be bad. Somewhere around here, I would wake up, and the dream felt like a nightmare. The dream of becoming a writer is a little like that dream. To achieve your dream, you have to leave your safe place in which you feel confident and you can fly easily. But you have to fly out into the world, and you begin to lose height. And if you're unlucky, you land flightlessly in a crowd of unsympathetic strangers, and your dream turns out to be a nightmare. But if you're lucky and determined, the dream recurs, and gradually you discover you don't need the protection of your bedroom to stay up in the air. And you can fly out through the window without feeling endangered. You don't lose height, you don't lose control. You can navigate through the air of the world. Maybe you soar, but once you have found your wings, however long it takes, however many times you have failed before you found them, once you've found your wings, you fly. Thank you.